Today marks 4 whole years since we left the European Union, our Independence Day, if you will. And I thought it right to see what we've missed out on in that period. Why not start with the directives the European Union has implemented since our departure? Remember that word, directives, those ghastly, bossy policies we had to follow that wasted your money fretting about the curvature of bananas and cucumbers. Well, GB News journalist Keith Bayes has calculated that we have dodged not just one bullet, but several magazines of bullets fired as if from a Gatling gun. We have dodged a whopping 4,500 directives since our departure, which, as Keith points out, equates to about 451 miles of paper if printed out and placed end to end, which, if you did that, would make the journey from Somerset to Scunthorpe and back again, a journey, as you probably know from earlier broadcasts, I'll be making tomorrow. So let's have a look at some of these directives that we have missed. The EU's Gender Directive, which requires that listed companies have 40% of non-executive directors or 33% of all directors be members of the underrepresented sex by the middle of 2026, inevitably sacrificing meritocracy on the altar of diversity inclusion. Seems the EU has become an ESG, environmental, social and governance, dystopian nightmare since we left. For example, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. That's quite a mouthful, isn't it? That's just bureaucratic in and of itself. It requires large firms to report on their ESG ratings. It also, even more obsessed than ever, with the green agenda. Take the Land Use Directive, which is set to expropriate land from landowners, all in the name of greenery. And we see a similar phenomenon with the Fit for 55 initiative or the Nature Restoration Law, which forces landowners to turn their fields into marshland. Now, these directives underlie the recent disorder seen in France, the riots, the burning, the blocking of roads, and similarly in Germany and the Netherlands, because the unaccountable, undemocratic EU is to some extent getting its comeuppance as people realise they don't like these directives, which we have missed. But we've also not missed out on any trade deals because the EU hasn't done any. It's still struggling to get its trade deal with Australia completed because the EU doesn't like free trade, while we managed to reach an Australian free trade agreement in under 2 years of leaving the EU. And this is where the fabled cheaper food and wine will come from. It's free trade deals with agricultural countries that can provide good quality products to us at lower prices. And the EU, on the other hand, has just withdrawn from trade negotiations with a bloc of South American countries because of French farmers attempting to establish a sixth republic. So we've replicated 40 of the 43 deals we had as members of the EU, as well as negotiating FTAs with Australia and New Zealand, improved deals with Singapore, Ukraine and Japan. We're in negotiations with India and the Gulf Cooperation Council, and we've improved our deals with Canada, Mexico, Switzerland and Israel, none of which we could have done from within the EU because trade was an EU competence. And in the year to March 2022, the latest figures available, the Department of International Trade resolved 192 trade barriers in 79 countries, not to mention the fact that we've joined, and we were legislating just on Monday, for the CPTPP bloc, projected to outgrow the EU enormously over coming decades. All of this, and yet UK-EU trade is up since we left. But perhaps I'm being too harsh on the EU. Let's look at the economy. The Eurozone and EU growth for 2022 was 3.33 and 3.61% respectively. But the UK outgrew both measures with 4.3%. Again, perhaps too harsh, but what if we look country by country? Well, France, similar to us in many ways, is a fair test, but we have a bigger economy, just slightly. And since the pandemic, which was the year we left, our economy has outgrown the French economy. The German economy, the manufacturing hub of Europe, has actually entered into a recession last year. It actually shrank, which is the first time that Germany has been falling behind and stopping being the engine of EU growth. And the IMF, the UK-hating IMF, thought that the UK would be the only economy to contract in 2023, but we grew, and the only economy to shrink in the G7 was, in fact, the poor old Germans. Now, that doesn't mean we're in the land of milk and honey. There are always problems. But the lesson of the statistics is that we're doing pretty well outside the EU. The countries that have actually grown the most post-pandemic are the US, Canada, India, and many CPTPP members, which is where we're now looking, rather than the overly regulated, overly protectionist, and overly bureaucratic European Union. So to our friends and neighbours in Brussels, it was fun while it lasted. Well, not really. But today, on the 4th anniversary of our departure, I can claim that we have no regrets.